So, as a matter of introduction, let me say a little bit about background to the book of Galatians. The letter is written to Shaul's non-Jewish disciples who are living in Asia Minor. It's far from Jerusalem, far from the centers of Jewish diaspora. They're out there. And the letter does not directly instruct Jews, and the questions that are raised in the letter do not apply directly to Jews in Shaul's understanding. He's addressing it specifically to those people who are living in that region of Galatia. And the crisis of the letter is that some unknown teachers have come to this Galatian province and began teaching people, teaching views contrary to how Shaul explains the scriptures. And this is the reason why Shaul decided to write and address the questions that their teachings had brought forward. We actually do not possess the teachings of these people themselves. All we have is Shaul's answer, his letter, his rebuttal. And so what we have is his condemnations of their teachings. And you have to realize that this is one-sided impression, and of course he's passionate about what he's writing, but we actually do not know exactly and precisely what was the content of these teachings. There are a few things that we can kind of figure out. What we do know is that clearly the people who came and started teaching Galatian believers were promoting circumcision, which circumcision is essentially an act of full and formal conversion to Judaism. And its conversion to, Jewishness, its conversion to Jewish people, let me clarify that, because Judaism may not be the proper term to use in that particular time and era. Now, Shaul, from reading the letter, it's clearly that he's very adamant he's very against this idea of circumcision for his disciples. And then he goes through the letter and explains his position. The question of this formal conversion, meaning circumcision, sets the occasion for him to express his beliefs about all kinds of things in this letter, specifically about what are the requirements of godly life for non-Jewish believers in Messiah, what is their relationship to Torah exactly from his perspective, what is their relationship to Israel, how are they connected to all these issues. And these are the matters actually that are easy to misunderstand, because we are reading a small letter, by Shaul, who has a very particular theology, and he only offers so much to us. So we would, to get a bigger look, we'd have to look at other places, perhaps some of his other writings, to maybe get some clarity on some points. But I'm going to try to keep us in Galatians as much as I can. The letter has become controversial in many ways, and what happened is Christian theologians throughout the ages have adapted its strong words and its strong logic, the fighting points, you want to say, to fight their opponents, their theological opponents. Whatever theology they fought, doesn't really matter. Whoever their opponents were throughout the history, they just used the strong language of Galatians. Sometimes it was the Torah itself that people were trying to condemn. Sometimes it was Judaism that was the polemics with. In the case of Martin Luther, it was the Catholic Church. He interpreted the entire letter of Galatians vis-a-vis this is the depiction of a Catholic Church. That's how he understood it theologically. So it doesn't really matter what people have, how they have curiously interpreted this letter before, but out of that came a lot of interpretations that are floating around still today, and how this letter should be understood. And so a lot of it has to do with things connected to Jewish life and observance, and it's being discussed in this letter. So a lot of times the questions of Jewish life and practice come up, and people end up quoting from Galatians. Why? It's because of these interpretations. But as I said, Shaul, he is writing to a non-Jewish audience in Asia Minor, in Turkey. And Torah observance is a slightly different question for him in this letter. So let me say a few more things about this. Because this letter is so polemicized, because it's become such a theological hotbed, it's very important for us to keep our minds as clear as possible. And the challenge is for you and I, when we read it, is to study it as carefully as we can, asking the right questions. And the questions that I want everyone to ask as we study Galatians is, what was going through the mind of someone like Shaul? Not what this means to me, not how this applies to my life. That's the last question you should ask. The first question you should ask in looking at the words themselves is, what do these words mean to Shaul? To people like him in his day and time. What do these words mean to Galatians? Shaul is a first century Jew. He's former Pharisee at that moment in life. And Galatians, they are kind of this open-hearted, Hellenized Gentiles, citizens of the Roman Empire, who are filled with all those ideas, and what their world experiences. So you have to ask yourself, what is going through their mind as they're reading these words? What is Paul trying to get through to them? So it's essential to put our theological convictions basically kind of aside, a little bit on the back burner if we can do that, and allow ourselves, if we can, to hear Shaul outside of all these interpretations. So to understand Shaul's thinking, let me give you a few important conceptual things about his idea world that he lives in, his conceptual world. Second Temple period Jews, I would characterize them as very ethnocentric. And also not just ethnocentric, but also very analogy-driven Semitic thinking. Everything is like something else. There's a lot of comparisons that you will see. And also, we should not underestimate the spiritual inferences that Shaul makes all the time. There's symbols typical of that era. Often he has a very eschatological kind of end times, big, battle of good and evil outlook on life. And that's very typical of people in his time and place. And we don't always look at life this way, but imagine this combination of these worldviews kind of going through his mind as he's writing this letter. And that's what he's dwelling on, and therefore that's how he writes. I'll try to point out these nuances and issues as we go through the letter the best I can without taking too much time away from the content. So that having been said, kind of sets us up for the very first section of Galatians, chapter 1. I'm going to read 5 verses, which is the introduction. In chapter 1, Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are with me, to the churches of Galatia. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins, so that he might rescue us from this present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be the glory forevermore. Amen. So, here's the introduction to his letter. These 5 verses. If you notice, the very first thing that he says as he introduces himself, very clearly we see that it's a letter. He's saying who he is writing, who is he addressing himself to. He says that he's an apostle, meaning a sent one. That's all the word apostle means. A lot of times people think that it's some kind of religious hierarchy office or something like that. Really all it means in Greek is somebody who was sent. He's a shaliach in Hebrew. He's the one who was sent to spread the religious message. And he says specifically that he is not from men, and not through the agency of a man, but from God directly. So if you read these lines and you look at them carefully, you would see that right away from the very beginning, from the very first words in the letter, it sounds like Shaul is adopting a very defensive posture. He's out to prove that he's a divinely sent messenger, not sent by humans. Why would he say this unless he's really trying to say something, to prove himself? And as I read these words, I see this almost defense coming up right away. And remember, this is a letter that is polemical. Perhaps he believes that his audience will accept this fact that he's a divinely sent messenger, and this will give him credibility with his disciples. Maybe someone has accused him of being the opposite. So he's saying, I'm not sent by people. I'm really sent directly by God. Maybe somebody said he's just a messenger of some group, some party. Maybe he stresses this point because this issue is what sets him apart from those who are currently teaching and confusing Galatians. Maybe he's simply trying to differentiate himself from people whom he considers his opponents. They're teaching things contrary to what he's teaching. So we have to guess on this because, again, we don't have the actual teachings of the people who came to Galatia. But also curiously to note in verse 2 that you see that this letter is not just from him, but it also says that it's from others whom Shaul calls his brothers who are with him, and he includes them as the senders of this letter as well. So he even props himself up, not just a letter from me, but from me and those guys who are with me. So very interesting little detail that not everybody notices. And to whom is this letter addressed? It's addressed to the assemblies of Galatia, or it says right here, to the churches of Galatia. Now it's important to note that he is addressing in this letter not one large group. We're used to this image of a church being a bunch of people, and that is not the reality in that day and time and in that particular geographic region. He is addressing his letter to several groups, several small groups actually, that are in Galatia, which is Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey. If you look at the map and you kind of look through the middle to the very center of Turkey, that's really where Galatia was, the very center of Turkey. Southern Galatia, northern Galatia, we're not quite sure which exact region it was to, but either one of those places is located in modern day Turkey. And it's a Roman province at that time. And we can assume that the people who are living there, it's kind of really in the middle of nowhere. It's very hard to get there today. If you were to visit the region of Galatia today, it's hard to get there, actually. There's no major, massive highways or roads even running there today. It wasn't that different in his day. We can assume from this information, knowing what region he's addressing to, that the people who are populating it are basically Gauls, or Celts as they were called. They're ethnically tribal people. They're non-Jews for certain, and most probably at that point they were very Hellenized. They were very Greek thinking, because the entire region has been taken over, since the days of Alexander. The entire region has been Hellenized thoroughly. Greek thinking, Greek culture, Greek art, all these things have permeated every fiber of the society. And so that's who the audience really is. Now, if you notice, he addresses his words in Greek. It says tais ecclesiais, the gatherings or the assemblies. Ecclesia is the word. That doesn't really translate to church. It really means those who gathered or assembled together. And he addresses it to those assemblies that are scattered through the entire region of Galatia. So imagine there's a bunch of little groups scattered through an entire state. And he's addressing a letter to all these different groups. They have connections to each other, but maybe not so tight, maybe not so close. There's some disunity. And all these assemblies exist because these people are gathered together because they believe in the message of Yeshua. They believe in him as the Messiah. That's what actually brought them together in the first place. Most likely, as I said, they're small. Most likely these gatherings are patterned on Jewish houses of prayer. Most Jewish houses of prayer at that time, they were home-style synagogues. In many of the Roman provinces where Jews lived, somebody prominent would have a home large enough that they would open for the purpose of prayer. They wouldn't be a building dedicated necessarily for those things, unless the Jewish community was quite large, but a lot of times people opened their houses, and that became a place of communal prayer. So this is probably not different. People get together at home. These are small gatherings. And it's really important for me to know that these are not churches in the sense of the modern Western thinking. When you hear word church in English, all kinds of things pop up in your mind. And that's not what these gatherings were. Because at this point, they had no special worship, they had no buildings, no religious decor, no rituals, no hierarchy, no strict structure or liturgy of any sort, no offices, no rites. They just got together for the purpose of fellowship, for the purpose of prayer, maintaining their spiritual path that was revealed to them. They were really getting together to fellowship and to encourage each other and to try to grow spiritually, to share that which they have learned and to share their spiritual journey, their experiences with each other, really. And that's really how simple these gatherings were. So to say that these are churches of Galatia, kind of paints this wrong impression in your mind right away. Mm-hmm. It's also important to remember to read Shaul's words in their proper historical context. There was no Christianity at this point as a cohesive religion with its own rights. The only ideological camps that existed in that area would be folk religions, Roman paganism, official state religion, and now we're bringing Judaism to the mix now, and that's what we have. So these people, who would they have examples? Galatians. If they were to try to figure out what does it mean to live like a person, worthy of the calling, who believes in God, in this God of Israel, how would they try to pattern their life? Who would they take as an example in their society? It's very difficult, because while you and I may be living in the Western society and we have an idea of what a godly person is supposed to look like or act like or believe like or adhere to, they didn't really have any pattern to follow. So think of the difficult path that they had and how confusing that can be, which is exactly what happens. So naturally, if Shaul is the one who brought them to this belief in Messiah, they would take him as an example, right? And that's whom they will follow. That's who they will pattern their life after. And no one at this time actually dreamed of creating like a separate religion or anything like that. It's likely that these believers in Galatia saw themselves as a part of Jewish faith, as a part of Jewish life, as a part of somehow attached to Israel through their belief, through their experience. After all, they believed in Israel's Messiah, the one who was promised by Israel's prophets, and so their point of reference, that's the only connection they really had. And naturally, that's what they would gravitate to. And so believing in Messiah in their society, in their world, made them a minority, a serious underclass. They required community support, not to be swayed by the dominating ways of pagan majority. Because the world in which they lived in was thoroughly pagan. And now that they've embraced this belief in Jewish Messiah, they had to fight against the system. And everything in that society was just not in line with Jewish ethics or scriptures and the kind of principles that we read there. So that's the place they find themselves, and that's the reasoning, a lot of the reasoning behind Shaul addressing his disciples this way. Interesting remark you need to see of how, just in passing, Shaul describes Yeshua's mission in his greeting, as a part of his greeting. This is a part of his regular introduction and his greeting, yet just kind of very briefly he summarizes that Yeshua gave himself for our sin to rescue us from the present evil age. This is a really neat statement, a statement that is not his main point at all. You could see that he just says it very, very quickly, kind of in passing. He doesn't dwell on it. But I think it is really telling of what Shaul has as his perception of who Yeshua really is and what his mission really was. The words that he chooses to describe Yeshua in such concise and brief way actually are telling of what he thinks about it. See, he doesn't say that Yeshua came to free us from the fires of hell, right? He doesn't say that he came to lay a path for us to heaven. He doesn't say that he came to save our souls or transfer us out of the darkness into the kingdom of light or anything of some other spiritual transcendent sounding goal. What you're seeing here is a very earthly, very immediate reasoning in these words. It's very down to earth, and certainly this is a very Jewish outlook, very consistent with the idea of what Tanakh shows about salvation. What Jews believe salvation is not some esoteric, distant, one day when I die, I'll go to heaven salvation. Salvation is now, salvation is real, salvation is something that affects my life today, it makes it better today. I'm experiencing the effects of salvation right now. So it's very, kind of down to earth, very real touch and feel salvation rather than someday I will surely be redeemed and all things will be better. Very Jewish thinking. That's why he says that he came to rescue us from this present evil age. That even this present evil age is not going to have an effect on the followers of Yeshua. It's a pretty neat and telling statement. So that's, in a sense, in a nutshell, is the introduction that Shaul lays out for us. Now I want you to look at the rest of the verses, verses 6 through 10, where he begins addressing the problem from the very foundation. Verse 6 says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which really is not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. And we have said before, so I say again to you now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. So you see, he starts addressing the problem right away. How quickly you're deserting him who called you by the grace of Messiah. Now, Shaul is surprised how quickly recipients of his letter are turning from his teachings. How they're shifting from Hashem, who called them, who summoned them. How they move away from the favor of Messiah to a very different version of the good news. Shaul thinks that they're now moving away from this simple message he gave them. And apparently someone is agitating them, someone is stirring them, someone is wanting them to change and alter the good news of Messiah they know. Now here's something to realize. Galatians did not have the benefit that you and I have. We can all read. We have God's revelation. We have something we can look up. We can read, we can study, we can search. Imagine that most of them, if any of them were illiterate, they couldn't read. It was very typical for people in that time not to have a good education, not to be able to read. Only the elites were really highly educated and knew how to read and write. So imagine these small groups where people can't read. And even if they could read, it's not like there's copies of Tanakh floating around. It's not like they have the Torah that they can bring out. Even if they could read, they could probably read Greek. It's doubtful they'll be able to read Hebrew. So even if they got lucky to get a hold of Septuagint, there's no printing presses. It would have to be handwritten. And you know how expensive that book would be? people ordinarily wouldn't be able to afford a copy on their own. It would be a community-held copy or a library copy of some sort. It just wouldn't be accessible to people. So what information do these Galatians really have? How can they hold on to the faith that has been given to them? How can they fight a teaching that's not correct or false? People always say, well, how easy they got confused. Well, the truth is, if we knew how little they knew about these spirituality, we would understand how easy it was to confuse them. When you know very little and there's no way to check the message that people are giving you, it's very easy to be misled. And that's exactly what's happening to them. Shaul understands the situation. That's why he's writing a letter, to provide him the counsel, to provide him this valuable input. Still, he's amazed that they're not holding on to his teaching. So he's talking about these people coming and bringing them different good news. Notice that it says right here that they were called by the grace. That's a really important statement here. He says that they were called or summoned, the Galatian believers, en chariti in Greek, in favor. You see, for Shaul, charis is a loaded theological term, actually. If you think about it, you'd have to kind of cross-reference a few places in the Torah to really understand what it means. You see, in Hebrew, the word is chen, which people can translate as grace, or you can translate as favor. I prefer word favor rather than grace. And the reason why I like word favor better than grace is because word grace is highly charged and loaded word in English language. So when I say grace, people have all kinds of ideas of what that means because of the different theology that's kind of floating in their minds. So if I purposefully replace it with the word favor, all of a sudden I do not awaken the same type of reaction and not allow your minds to follow down the theological trails which have been blazed already many times. So it's kind of forcing people to think a little bit outside the box. And actually the word favor is a really good and precise translation of this word chen or charis in Greek. So you see, Hebrew word chen can also mean not just favor, but it can mean kindness. It can mean goodwill. It can mean attractiveness and even beauty. So think of the range of meanings of the word chen. Remember, it was in Torah, it was Noah. It was the one who first found chen, found charis, found favor in the eyes of the Lord. It's in it's in 6th chapter of Genesis. Noah was the first one. And the connection of these verses to Torah, connecting grace, connecting favor to Torah is really important because that's the world in which Shaul lives. Don't forget, whenever he uses terminology, if it is a terminology that comes, it's a Greek terminology that comes originally from Hebrew, that's his world in which he lives. So that's probably what he means when he says those things. We have to refer back to the world in which he lived. So, hen, charis, the connection of this particular concept to Torah I think is quite important, especially when you consider Noah, and especially if we think that, like Galatians, Noah is not a Jew, he's a Gentile, actually not circumcised, yet he enjoyed a relationship with God that was quite dynamic. So that particular idea and concept has to be relevant, in particular to the question of circumcision. But what does Shaul mean by this good news, the gospel, evangelion? What does it mean to him? Well, certainly it doesn't mean the style of music many people are familiar with. And certainly it doesn't mean some presentation of 4 spiritual laws or anything of that sort in that matter. What it means, however, to him is something that comes from the book of the prophets.
that is the world in which Shaul lives, and that is something that he knows well. That is his reference point. The prophets do speak about good news, and when they do, when we come across those passages, we start to get an idea of what this concept, this term must have meant for Shaul. Because for us it means something very different today. So much has changed, theology has brought people to a different place, a different understanding. But for Shaul, remember, there's no Christianity, there's no theology. The gospel, good news, is a relatively new term. What did it mean to him? Well, I'm going to read a couple of passages for you from the prophets, just kind of to give you a little glimpse of what kinds of verses might have popped up into a person's head when they heard good news, and specifically the good news of Messiah, and they're thinking about this prophetic message. So this is out of Isaiah 41. Comfort, oh comfort my people, says your God. Speak kindly to Jerusalem and call out to her that her warfare has ended, that her iniquity has been removed, that she has received of the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness, make a smooth path in a desert, a highway for our God. Let every valley be lifted up, and every mountain and every hill be made low, and let the rough ground become a plain, and the rugged terrain a broad valley. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And then verse 9. Get yourself up on high mountain, or Zion, bearer of good news. Lift up your voice mightily, or Jerusalem, bearer of good news. Lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. You can see how passages like that, speaking about good news, what good news, what is the good news in this passage? And the answer is, of course, it's the restoration of Israel. Of course, it's coming into a glory, so to say, coming back to a former glory, or maybe coming into a state in which people have never been in before. So that's the idea that kind of comes in. Here is your God. Your God is in your midst. That's the good news. Is that not the good news of the Messiah? Isaiah 52:6, another passage, verses 6 and on. Therefore my people shall know my name. Therefore in that day I am the one who is speaking. Here I am. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news. He announces peace and brings good news of happiness. Who announces salvation and says to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, your watchmen lift up their voices. They shout joyfully together, for they will see with their own eyes when the Lord restores Zion. Break forth, shout joyfully together, you waste places of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, that all the ends of the earth may see the salvation of our God. You see, another powerful passage. And what is the good news in this passage? Once again, it's the restoration of Israel. Once again, Messiah is involved. The good news here is that God is doing this with his right arm, with his holy arm, which is, of course, is an acronym for Messiah. And the good news here is being proclaimed, is being spread, just like Yeshua would, or his disciples would, that, hey, the kingdom of God is near. It's right here. God is going to reign. God says, here I am, in this passage in Isaiah 52 we just read. And in the previous one it says, behold, or here is your God. So this resonates very much with the message of Yeshua that he preached. And when we think about it, Isaiah 52, right after this passage, if you keep reading, comes the Song of the Servant. What is the Song of the Servant in Isaiah but a description of who Messiah is? And of course, later Isaiah 53 is the suffering servant passage, which talks about the particular affliction that the servant is supposed to carry on behalf of his people. So, as we think about these verses, as we reflect on how Shaul must have understood good news, we're starting to see it in his light, if we can allow us to concentrate specifically on these meanings. That's what good news must have meant for Shaul. In verse 7 and 9, we see that Shaul has a very definite news of Messiah in mind. And other messages that are being proclaimed, other versions of good news, to him are not really good news. Anybody who adapts or anybody who alters or changes the story, Shaul says very emphatically that they're not to be listened. Even if he or his associate, even if the angel from heaven comes and tell them a different good news, a different message, then they're not to listen to it. That person should not be believed. In fact, the person should be accursed. It's a pretty big emphatic statement, considering, of course, that this is also said more than once. It's said twice, repeated in a row. We get the point that this is a big deal for Shaul. And then in verse 10 that we just read a little earlier, Shaul asks the rhetorical question, whether he sounds like a person who's trying to please men. He said, am I the kind of, do I sound like I'm trying to please people? Or am I the servant of God? Apparently, we don't know this for sure, but this may have been a characterization that was given to him by his opponents, by those teachers who came and taught in Galatia. We don't know this for sure. I'm speculating here. But why would he say such an emphatic statement unless this is an answer to a charge or something of that sort? You know, it could have been said about Shaul that, hey, Shaul, he's such a nice, accommodating fellow. He came and he preached the good news to you, and he told you all about the God of Israel and the Torah and all these wonderful things. But you know, he didn't say anything about circumcision because, well, he was trying to be nice to you. He did not want to make it difficult. He didn't want to burden you. Circumcision is a big deal. In the Greco-Roman society, if you realize how much of a taboo it was, circumcision. Greco-Roman world extols human body. They worshipped human body. All the statues and the art that they depict, every time people are naked. Competing athletes are naked. The beauty of human body is really lifted up in that society, in that culture. And so imagine somebody who sees human body as really the epitome of perfection and beauty, and then you come in and you ruin it. You spoil it by taking away a portion of it. Circumcision, it's such a actually profound, so to say, statement that it would have spoken to Greeks and Romans in a very loud way. So imagine that somebody can say this to Shaul, saying, well, you know, this Shaul, he's an accommodating guy. He didn't want to bother you. He didn't want to trouble you. He knew that it was going to be hard for you to get circumcised. He knew that it was going to come all kinds of persecution because of the circumcision. So just don't worry about it. That's what he said. But we're going to tell you the truth. Really, circumcision is necessary. It's important. So I can imagine a charge like this being leveled at Shaul, that he's just trying to please men. He's trying to be liked by everyone, so he's not preaching circumcision to these Gentiles who really need it. You know, once again, circumcision had serious implications in that society. There were plenty of Jewish men who underwent surgery in those days to have the process reversed. Why? Because they wanted acceptance. Why? Because they wanted to go to a bathhouse and not be seen strange. Why? Because they wanted to compete in the Olympic events where they had to be naked. And they would have been seen in that way. So, many Jewish men actually tried to reverse that process. It was a big issue in those days. And so perhaps this is why this statement is coming up here, that Shaul is trying to please men, and that's why he concludes this verse 10 saying, I'm not trying to please anybody, I am really a servant of God. And so it seems to me that he's trying to clear his character here, that he is Hashem's servant, and to him, whether somebody likes him or not, whether it makes it easy or difficult for them, that's not the issue. He is going to speak the truth of God. So perhaps he's answering this charge in these verses. And this concludes the passage that we wanted to discuss this time, up to verse 10. Next session we will start our discussion from verse 11 and on.